September 2nd, 1457. The mountains of Albania still held the cold breath of the previous night when the first horn sounded through the Drin valley. Fog clung to the ridgelines like burial cloth, obscuring the peaks of the Kruja highlands, muffling every sound until the world felt underwater, strange and slow. The leaves had begun to turn, the first faint blush of autumn gold on the chestnuts, the rowans already deep red, as if the forest knew what color the day would demand. Down below, in the narrow pass near the Albulena plain, 40,000 Ottoman soldiers marched. They moved like a jeweled serpent, impossibly long, armored in steel and silk and certainty. Janissaries at the core, Akunchi raiders on the flanks, Sipahi cavalry gleaming under a muted sky. Their banners caught the still morning air barely at all, but the sound of their march, 60,000 boots and hooves on packed Albanian soil, was a sound that could not be mistaken. It was the sound of empire. It was the sound of inevitability, or so they believed. Watching from the high ridges, hidden in the tree line, pressed low against cold stone and colder earth, were perhaps 10,000 Albanians. No banners, no horns, no drums. They had had no cavalry to speak of, no heavy artillery, no complex siege train. What they had was this mountain, this fog, and a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly how Ottoman armies die. His name was Gjergj Kastrioti. The world knew him as Skanderbeg. The numbers alone should have ended this before it began. 4-1, perhaps worse. The Ottomans had just finished ravaging the Albanian coast. Their soldiers were battle-hardened, well-supplied, and led by a capable commander named Isa Beg Ishakovic, who had been given one simple order: end the Albanian resistance, permanently. But here is what empires never seem to learn, no matter how many mountaintops they have crossed. Terrain is not neutral. Ground is not passive. A narrow pass is not just a route of march. It is a killing field, if someone patient enough to use it stands waiting above. This battle, fought in a single morning in the autumn of 1457, would not merely defeat an Ottoman army. It would shatter the myth of Ottoman invincibility in the Balkans, at a moment when that myth was Europe's most dangerous shared belief. It would keep Albania free for another 2 decades, long enough to frustrate 3 sultans. It would make one man's name so feared in Constantinople that Mehmed the Conqueror himself, fresh form taking Constantinople only 4 years earlier, would refuse to commit to a full Albanian campaign as long as Skanderbeg breathed. This was the moment a nation decided it would not die quietly, and it very nearly never happened at all. To understand why 40,000 men were marching through Albanian fog that morning, you have to understand what the Ottoman Empire was in 1457. Not the decaying empire of later centuries, not the cautious, defensive power the 19th century would know. This was the Ottoman Empire at the height of its terrifying early momentum, a military civilization that had, within living memory, consumed Serbia, Bulgaria, much of Greece, and most shatteringly, Constantinople itself. May 29th, 1453, 4 years before Albulena. The walls that had protected the Roman world for over 1,000 years had fallen in a single day to Mehmed II, a sultan barely 21 years old, who had dragged cannons through impossible terrain to blast a new kind of hole in an old kind of world. When Constantinople fell, it wasn't just a city that died. It was a psychological barrier. The sense that there were some things the Ottomans simply could not take. That sense died too. After Constantinople, the pressure on every remaining Christian state in the Balkans intensified to a fever pitch. The Ottomans did not operate on a schedule of contentment. There was no version of Ottoman grand strategy that accepted a stable frontier indefinitely. The machinery of expansion required new territories to feed its armies, to reward its warriors, to justify the Sultan's divine mandate. And in the Western Balkans, one stubborn knot of resistance refused to unravel: Albania. Albania in the 15th century was not a unified kingdom. It was a patchwork of mountain clans, rival lords, coastal trading cities, and ancient blood feuds older than anyone alive could remember. The Balkans had always been this way, too fragmented to defend collectively, too proud to surrender individually. The Ottomans understood this perfectly, and for decades they had exploited it, peeling away one Albanian lord at a time, absorbing families into the Ottoman administrative and military system, converting, pressuring, bribing. It had worked beautifully with most of them. It had not worked with Gjergj Kastrioti. Skanderbeg's story is one of the most extraordinary personal trajectories in the history of the medieval world, and it matters to understand this battle because his experience inside the Ottoman system is precisely what made him so lethal outside it. As a boy, he had been taken as a hostage to the Ottoman court, the son of the Albanian lord Gjergj Kastrioti, handed over as a guarantee of his father's loyalty. He was raised in the Ottoman system, educated in Ottoman tactics, trained in Ottoman horsemanship and swordsmanship. He served in the Ottoman army for 2 decades, rising to the rank of military commander, fighting Ottoman battles in Anatolia and the Balkans. And then, in November 1443, at the Battle of Niš, while the Ottoman army was in disarray following a Hungarian-led crusader attack, Skanderbeg did something that stunned everyone who knew him. He forged a letter in the name of Sultan Murad II, used it to reclaim the fortress of Kruja from its Ottoman garrison, raised the double-headed eagle of his family, and declared himself Lord of Albania. He was 43 years old. He had 30 years of Ottoman military training stored in his memory, and he had just declared war on the most powerful military empire on earth. What followed was not a rebellion. It was not a desperate last stand of a dying culture. It was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare conducted by someone who had studied the enemy from the inside. Skanderbeg formed the League of Lezhë in 1444, uniting for the first time in living memory the major Albanian clans under a single military command, his own. He fought and won the Battle of Torviol in 1444. He fought and won at Oranic in 1446. At Berat in 1450, he was handed one of his few defeats, but he extracted his army intact and was back in the field within months. The Ottomans sent armies at him repeatedly, 3 major campaigns under Sultan Murad II alone, and each time, the armies came back smaller. This was not simply bravery. Bravery without intelligence gets you killed in a hurry. What Skanderbeg possessed was something rarer, an intimate understanding of how Ottoman armies were structured, how they communicated, what their weaknesses were, and how to choose terrain that negated their overwhelming numerical advantages. He knew that Ottoman Sipahi cavalry was devastating in open ground and nearly useless in mountain defiles. He knew that Ottoman logistics chains were long and vulnerable. He knew that Ottoman armies expected to impose their pace on a campaign, and that disrupting that expectation, making them react instead of act, was the foundation of everything. By 1457, Isa Beg Ishakovich had been tasked with what was, in theory, a straightforward mission. Albania was exhausted after 13 years of continuous war. The Albanian lords were increasingly fractious. Some had already made separate peaces with the Ottomans. Skanderbeg's coalition was smaller than it had been at its peak. The time seemed right for a decisive campaign that would simply flood the country with enough soldiers to make continued resistance mathematically impossible. Isa Beg was not a fool. He was a capable administrator and a solid military commander who had served the empire well across multiple theaters. He had roughly 40,000 soldiers under his command. Some accounts say more, some slightly less, but the rough order of magnitude is consistent across sources. This force included the elite Janissary infantry, the finest professional soldiers in the world at that moment, Sipahi cavalry from the Rumelian provinces, and a large contingent of Akuncha irregular horsemen who served as raiders, scouts, and a mobile screen. It was a combined arms force that had broken far more formidable opponents than one Albanian warlord and his mountain clans. The problem Isa Beg could not fully solve, the problem that would kill him, was that he had to move this army through Albanian territory to reach Skanderbeg. And Albanian territory is not kind to large armies. The country is a wilderness of ridges and valleys, of gorges where the sky narrows to a strip of light overhead, of passes where 100 men properly placed can make 100,000 bleed. Isa Beg knew this in the abstract. He had maps, he had scouts, he had local informants who had been feeding the Ottomans information about Albanian movements. Their movements. There is something deeply unsettling about marching a large army through hostile mountain terrain, and it is not simply the physical difficulty. It is the psychological weight of knowing that you are watched. Every Albanian village that Isa Beg's scouts passed through had already been emptied, the people gone, the livestock driven into the high pastures, the grain stored underground or taken away on the backs of mules. This was not panic. This was practiced. Albanian communities had been doing this for a decade, the same way a village that has endured repeated floods learns to move its valuables to the second floor before the water rises. They did not wait to see if this Ottoman column would be the one to finally behave differently. They knew what Ottoman armies did to the places they passed through. They had seen it. They had buried the evidence. So Isa Beg's army marched through a country that had already swallowed itself whole, and the silence of those empty villages was louder in some ways than screaming. You cannot interrogate a door that hangs open on a hinge. You cannot get intelligence from a village that has left no one behind to ask. And the scouts who ranged up the mountain tracks came back with the same report, again and again. Movement up above, on the ridge lines. Figures that dissolved into the tree line before anyone could count them. Fires that went cold before the scouts arrived. The sensation of being watched so completely and from so many angles that it began to affect the junior officers' sleep. But Isa Beg's army was 40,000 strong. These sensations, the watching, the emptiness, the echoes in the passes, these were the known cost of campaigning in Albania. They had been part of every Ottoman advance into this theater since the resistance began. They did not indicate a specific threat. They indicated a general hostility that his numbers were sufficient to overcome. Or so the operational logic ran. What his informants could not tell him, because no one who knew it was willing to betray it, was exactly where Skanderbeg would choose to make his stand. And Skanderbeg had already chosen. The Albulena plain, fed by the White Drin River and hemmed on multiple sides by ridgelines that his light Albanian infantry knew as intimately as they knew their own children's faces. The pass approaches were narrow enough to constrict the Ottoman column into a manageable width. The high ground on either flank was accessible to men who had grown up in these mountains, lethal to armored cavalry that needed room to deploy. Skanderbeg had perhaps 10,000 soldiers. Some sources say 8,000, some as many as 12, but 10 is a reasonable middle figure. And he had positioned them with the care of a man who understands that when you cannot win a fair fight, your only moral obligation is to make the fight unfair. The Albanian force was not homogeneous. It included the heavy cavalry of the Albanian nobility, the stratioti, those fierce horsemen who would later serve in armies across Europe, and a large contingent of light infantry, men who had been fighting in these hills since they could walk, who moved through the mountain terrain at a pace that astonished anyone trained on flat ground. They carried crossbows, spears, and the short, curved weapons of mountain warfare. What they did not carry was the weight of certainty that often makes large armies slow. There was one other element in Skanderbeg's arsenal. It was not a weapon anyone at the time would have classified as particularly novel. It was a terrain feature, a timing calculation, and an understanding of human psychology, all combined into a single operational concept that we would today call an ambush. But the way Skanderbeg executed it, the precision of the multiple coordinated attack vectors, the use of the river terrain to fragment the Ottoman column before the killing blow, the reserve force held back to exploit the chaos, elevated it beyond anything the Ottomans had encountered in this theater before. They were walking into a trap built by the one man alive who knew their playbook better than they did. In the days before September 2nd, the Albanian highlands were alive with the quiet, purposeful movement of men who knew they might not see the end of the week. Skanderbeg had been tracking Isa Beg's army for weeks. His network of scouts, Albanian mountain men who moved through the terrain like smoke, visible only when they chose to be, had been feeding him a continuous stream of intelligence about the Ottoman column's pace, composition, and direction of march. He knew roughly how many men Isa Beg commanded. He knew their order of march. He knew when they were likely to enter the Albulena corridor. What he needed was for them to commit deep enough into the pass that there would be no orderly withdrawal. The selection of the Albulena battlefield was not an accident, and it was not a desperate improvisation. Skanderbeg had been considering this ground for weeks, possibly months. The terrain worked on multiple levels simultaneously. The white Drin river ran along the valley floor, and its banks were soft enough in places to slow cavalry, treacherous enough to disorder infantry that tried to cross in haste. The ridgelines on either flank rose steeply enough that mounted troops could not ascend them quickly, but were not so steep that Albanian light infantry found them difficult. The valley itself was wide enough that the Ottoman column would spread out, loosening its formation, but narrow enough that the flanks could be sealed once the attack began. He divided his force into three principal elements. The first, his main strike force, he positioned on the northern ridgeline above the projected line of march of the Ottoman vanguard. This was his hammer. When the time came, these men would sweep down the slope in a controlled charge, striking the Ottoman column while it was still in march formation, before it could deploy into a proper battle line. The second element he placed on the southern approach, lower and more concealed, tasked with a specific mission. When the Ottoman cavalry tried to wheel and respond to the initial attack, this force would close the southern end of the pass, cutting off retreat. The third element, a reserve, held under his direct command, he kept on the high ground to the northeast, invisible from the valley floor. The reserve is where Skanderbeg's genius becomes most apparent to a modern military eye. Almost every commander of the period, when facing a force 4 times his size, would have committed everything to the initial assault: speed, shock, and God's favor. These were the operating principles of 15th century tactical thinking. You hit hard, you hit fast, and you trusted the chaos to favor the more motivated side. Skanderbeg did not think this way. He thought in phases. He thought about what would happen after the first shock, when the Ottoman column would begin to reorganize, when the most experienced Janissary officers would start to impose order on the chaos. That reorganization moment, the pivot from surprise to response, was where the reserve would strike. He would let the Ottomans believe they were recovering, and then he would break them again. The night before the battle, the night of September 1st, the Albanian camp was a contained and careful thing. There were no large fires, no celebration, no drinking, no loud prayers. Skanderbeg understood operational security with the thoroughness of a man who had spent 20 years in an army that took it seriously. The Ottomans had had their own scouts in these mountains, and a carelessly lit fire on a ridgeline would telegraph everything. But in small groups, in the shelter of boulders and under the canopy of the chestnut forest, the men prepared in the ways that soldiers have always prepared before days that might be their last. Blades were sharpened, a sound like a whispered argument, stone on steel, over and over. Armor straps were checked and rechecked, the familiar ritual of hands moving over familiar gear in the dark, making sure nothing would fail at the wrong moment. Some men prayed, the older ones mostly, lips moving in silent supplication to the Virgin, or to Christ, or sometimes to older names, mountain names, that the Church had never entirely succeeded in erasing from Albanian spiritual life. Some men wrote nothing and said nothing, and simply sat with their own faces in their own hands, doing the private arithmetic of danger that soldiers have always done before battle. The Stradioti cavalry, the Albanian horsemen who formed Skanderbeg's mobile punch, spent part of the night checking their horses, feeling for heat in legs that would be asked to descend steep ground at speed when the moment came. A horse that goes lame on a downhill charge is not just a lost horse. It is a chaos point, a rolling disaster that can unseat the men beside it. The Stradioti knew this. They worked in near silence, running hands down cannon bones and fetlocks, whispering reassurances to animals that could smell something wrong in the air. Skanderbeg air. Skanderbeg himself moved through his positions in the dark. This is documented in several accounts. His habit of personal inspection before engagement, his understanding that a commander who is seen by his men in the hours before dawn occupies a different place in their psychology than one who waits behind the lines. He did not make speeches. He was not that kind of commander. He moved from position to position, checked the sight lines, confirmed that the concealment was adequate, spoke quietly to the unit leaders about the signals, what horn call meant advance, what meant hold, what meant the reserve was coming. There is a quality to pre-battle darkness that soldiers describe across every century and every culture in almost exactly the same terms. The way ordinary sensations become abnormally vivid, the taste of metal in the mouth, the sound of your own breathing louder than it ought to be, the specific weight of the air just before dawn. The men on the ridgeline that night had been living this war for years, some of them their entire adult lives. They had buried fathers and brothers and cousins. They had watched villages burn. The Ottomans were not an abstraction to these men. They were the recurring nightmare of every family in the mountains, the reason why the livestock were hidden and the children knew to run before they could properly speak. This gave the Albanian fighters something that raw numbers cannot purchase, a personal stake so deep it bypassed reason and became physiological. They were not defending a king's ambition or a border drawn by diplomats. They were defending the specific places where their specific dead were buried. That distinction matters in battle. It matters in the dark hours before battle even more. Among the Albanian units on the northern ridge, there were men who had fought at Torviol in 1444, the first great victory 13 years ago, and men who had been children then and were now hardened soldiers. There were members of the Grat Albanian clans, the Muzaka and the Arianiti, serving alongside mountain men whose names history has not preserved, men who will always be the anonymous weight that makes famous victories possible. They lay against the cold rock and listened to the Ottoman army setting its camp miles to the east, and they felt the particular patience that comes to people who have learned to wait. He checked the fog. The fog. The fog was crucial. Albanian mountain fog in early September can be dense and long-lasting, clinging to the valley floors even after the sun has risen above the ridgelines. Skanderbeg needed the Ottoman column deep in the pass before they had full visibility. He needed them to be uncertain about exactly where the ridgelines were, exactly how many men were up there, exactly what was coming. Fog was his force multiplier. It would double his numbers in the mind of every Ottoman soldier who heard screaming from a direction he could not quite see. By the time the pre-dawn gray began to lighten the sky, every Albanian soldier was in position. The northern ridge, waiting. The southern blocking force, in place. The reserve, still, invisible, ready. Below them, the Ottoman column began to move. Isa Beg had established his camp some miles to the east the previous evening, and the army broke camp in the efficient, practiced manner of a force that had done this hundreds of times. The Akinci irregulars rode ahead as the advance screen, ranging out into the mist. The vanguard infantry followed, mostly garrison troops and provincial levies, the expendable lead of a large army's march. Behind them came the heavier elements, the janissaries, marching in their tight, disciplined files, their distinctive white felt bonnets visible even in the mist, and behind them, strung out along the valley road, the Sipahi cavalry and the supply train. The column was, at its full extent, several miles long. This was not unusual for an army of 40,000. It was, in fact, the geometric reality of moving that many men through a corridor of restricted width. The head would be engaging the enemy long before the tail even knew what direction the fighting was. Isa Beg was at the center of the column, the command position from which he could, in theory, react to threats from any direction. In theory. The Ottoman scouts had ranged up the valley and reported nothing alarming. Some signs of recent movement on the ridges, but that was expected in Albanian territory. There were always Albanians watching from the high ground. The Albanian army's main body was believed to be farther to the west, near Kruja, based on the intelligence that had reached Isa Beg in the previous days. The pass looked clear. The column moved forward. The fog was thick, and on the ridgelines above, 10,000 men breathed as quietly as they could and waited. The weapons the Albanians carried that day tell a story about the kind of fighting they intended. The Stratioti cavalry carried lances and curved sabers, weapons designed for the rapid, close-in slash of a downhill charge, rather than the sustained push of a flat-ground engagement. The light infantry carried a mix of crossbows, shorter, more maneuverable than the great English longbow, but effective at the ranges they would be shooting, and spears for the hand-to-hand work that would follow the missile exchange. Some carried axes, the weapon of choice in the mountain passes, where the fighting often devolved into a grinding, close-quarters struggle, where length of weapon mattered less than raw violence. The janissaries below them carried the finest weapons the Ottoman Empire could produce, composite bows of horn, sinew, and wood, capable of punching through armor at combat ranges, yatagan swords for close work, and increasingly, early firearms, handguns and the precursor forms of the arquebus that were beginning to appear in Ottoman military inventories. But firearms, in 1457, required a moment of stillness to operate, that charging cavalry and screaming men descending from above were specifically designed to prevent. The janissaries' great strength was discipline under sustained pressure. Skanderbeg intended to give them pressure they had not prepared for. He intended to give them surprise. And in the fog of a September morning, in a mountain pass they had been told was clear, that surprise was already moving into place. The signal, when it came, was a single long note from a curved horn, the kind of mountain horn that carries across ridges in ways that flat country instruments cannot. It cut through the fog at roughly the 3rd hour of morning, when the Ottoman column had committed its vanguard fully into the narrowest section of the Albulena Pass, when the janissaries were 2 miles deep and the Sipahis were still filing around the eastern bend, when the column was stretched too long to fold back on itself without creating a catastrophic traffic jam of men, horses, and weapons. The sound rose. It echoed off the rock faces above the valley. And then, silence. Half a heartbeat of pure silence. Then the Albanian infantry came off the northern ridge. Not 1 or 2 men testing the slope. Not a skirmish line moving cautiously through the trees. 10,000 voices opened simultaneously in the Albanian war cry, a sound that Ottoman veterans later described as something between a wolf howl and a human scream, something that bypassed the thinking mind and struck the animal one directly. And the hillside above the Ottoman column appeared to erupt with men. They came down the slope in a controlled rush, the light infantry first, releasing crossbow bolts into the packed mass of Ottoman troops below, before the enemy had fully processed what was happening. The fog amplified the sound and obscured the numbers. Every Ottoman soldier in the vanguard could hear the screaming, but could not see where it ended, could not tell if he was facing 1,000 men or 10,000, could not identify the edges of the attack, because in the mist, the edges didn't exist. It was as if the mountain itself had decided to fight. The first Ottoman troops to die did not have time to raise their weapons. The crossbow volley that preceded the charge was aimed downward, a brutal angle that punched through the tops of shields, through the gaps in armor that a downward trajectory creates. And the first 100 meters of the Ottoman vanguard buckled before the hand-to-hand fighting began. Men fell into the men behind them. The natural response of soldiers under unexpected attack from above is to crouch and look up, to shield their faces, to try to identify the threat. And that backward, upward lean is exactly wrong for maintaining cohesive formation. The vanguard fragmented. But the Ottomans were not panicking yet. Not yet. The Janissary officers at the center of the column were already reacting. These men were professionals in the most demanding sense of the word, soldiers who had been selected young, trained for years, conditioned to respond to exactly this kind of shock attack with organized counter-movement. The horn signals that answered Skanderbeg's attack were rapid and precise. Advance the center, clear the northern ridge, deploy the Sipahi cavalry to the flanks. It was the correct response. It was the response that would have worked against almost any opponent they had previously faced. But the Sipahi cavalry, when they tried to swing north to clear the ridgeline, hit the river. The river closes the trap. The white Drin's banks in the lower valley were, in September, soft with the residue of summer rains. Not impassable for cavalry, but slow. Murderously slow for heavy horsemen trying to execute a rapid flanking movement under fire. The first Sipahi riders who pushed toward the river found their horses' legs sinking into the bank mud at the worst possible moment, and the riders who came behind them could not turn quickly enough to avoid the confusion. The Sipahi deployment, which should have taken minutes, stretched into a grinding, cursing, wheeling chaos of horses that could hear the battle but could not reach it. On the southern slope, Skanderbeg's blocking force moved. This was the action that transformed an ambush into a catastrophe for the Ottomans. The blocking force, lighter troops, faster, tasked with one mission only, came down from the southern ridge and closed the western end of the pass behind the Ottoman column's tail elements. Not fully, not in a physical wall, but with enough speed and violence and noise to stop the rear of the column from moving forward to reinforce the center, and to cut off the instinctive Ottoman reaction of the rear guard, trying to wheel and form a new defensive line. The Ottoman column was now severed into 3 pieces: the vanguard, in full engagement with the Albanian main assault; the center, where the Janissaries were trying to organize a coherent counter; and the rear, which had just discovered that the road behind them was no longer open. Isa Beg, at the center, would have understood what was happening in these minutes with the sick, plummeting clarity that comes to commanders when they realize the battle they are fighting is not the battle they prepared for. He had 40,000 men. He had professional soldiers. He had the Janissaries, the finest infantry on earth. But he had them in a column in a fog-filled pass, attacked from above on both flanks, with a river preventing the cavalry from deploying, and an enemy who knew every fold of this terrain. He ordered the Janissaries forward, into the vanguard chaos, into the fog and the screaming and the Albanian crossbow fire. The Janissaries went. The center holds, and then it doesn't. By mid-morning, perhaps 2 hours after the first horn, the battle had settled into a brutal, grinding engagement in the lower valley. The Albanian infantry had come off the slopes and were fighting in the valley bottom, using the terrain features they knew intimately: the boulders, the tree lines, the sudden drops and angles that an army from the flat eastern provinces did not know at all. They fought in groups of 10 and 20, fluid and fast, refusing the kind of static line engagement where Ottoman numbers and discipline would tell. Every time the Janissaries managed to form a solid mass and push, the Albanians melted sideways into terrain and reformed somewhere unexpected. This was not how medieval battles were supposed to go. Medieval battle doctrine, Ottoman, European, Albanian, was built around the decisive clash of formed bodies of troops. 2 lines advance, 2 lines collide, and the side with more men, more armor, or more will eventually breaks the other. Skanderbeg was refusing to play. He was fighting a kind of mobile defensive battle that would not have looked entirely unfamiliar to a modern infantry officer. Attacking, withdrawing, reforming, attacking again from a different angle. And the Janissaries, superb as they were at fighting the battle they expected, were finding it difficult to fight this one. But the Janissaries were making progress. Slowly, painfully, step by step, their discipline and their numbers were beginning to push the Albanian main force back up the northern slope. The Albanian light infantry could not absorb indefinite punishment from 40,000 men, even in restricted terrain. The crossbow bolts were running low. Some Albanian units on the left flank had taken heavy casualties and were beginning to fragment. The southern blocking force was under growing pressure from the Ottoman rear elements, who had realized that their salvation lay in punching through the block and withdrawing into open country. By noon, Skanderbeg's plan was working, but it was not yet decided. The Ottomans were hurt, they were disordered, but they were still fighting, still dangerous, still capable of a rally that could turn the engagement. It was time for the reserve. The hammer drops. The reserve came off the northeastern ridge at a moment that every account agrees was precisely timed, though the accounts differ on exactly how Skanderbeg judged the moment. Some say he waited for a particular horn signal from his flanking commanders. Some say he had established a fixed time in advance, noon, when the fog would be thinning and his cavalry could see their targets. Some say he simply watched the battle from the high ground and moved when he felt the Ottoman center had committed fully enough forward that there was no weight left to meet what was coming. Whatever the trigger, the result was the same. The Stratioti cavalry, the Albanian heavy horsemen, pent up since before dawn, horses wound tight with 2 hours of hearing the battle and not being in it, came down the northeastern ridge in a charge that every contemporary account describes in terms of disbelief. Not disbelief at the cavalry's quality, though the Stratioti were formidable. Disbelief at the angle of descent. They came down a slope that Ottoman observers later said no sane cavalry force would attempt, horses digging in with their haunches on the steep sections, and then accelerating as the grade eased, building speed in the last 300 meters into something that by the time it hit the Ottoman column's exposed northern flank was less a cavalry charge than a geological event. The Janissaries on the northern flank of the Ottoman center, who had been dealing with the Albanian infantry assault for 2 hours, had no prepared formation to receive cavalry form their exposed side. They turned. They tried to reform. They almost managed it. Almost. The Stratioti hit them at full gallop, lances first, and the sound it made was something that survivors described in letters and chronicles for decades afterward. A dense, horrifying combination of screaming horses, breaking wood, the metallic clash of weapons, and beneath it all the lower sound of human beings meeting sudden, violent death in very large numbers. The Janissary line on the northern flank broke. Not bent, not stretched, broke. And when the Janissary line broke, the center of the Ottoman army broke with it, because the Janissaries were the spine. They were the psychological core around which every other element of an Ottoman army organized its courage. When they ran, and they ran, even the Janissaries, even the finest soldiers in the 15th century world, when cavalry hit them from the flank while they were already engaged frontally, and they could not see the extent of the attack in the thinning fog, when they ran, the provincial infantry and the auxiliary troops did not ask questions. They ran too, faster, harder. The pursuit, where armies die. What happened next was the phase that made Albulena a massacre rather than merely a defeat. An army that breaks and runs is more vulnerable than an army that hasn't yet fought. It has already spent its cohesion, its formation, its command structure. It is a crowd of armed men pointed in the same direction, away. And that direction led the fragmenting Ottoman force straight into the obstacles that Skanderbeg had prepared for exactly this moment. The southern blocking force, which had been holding the western end of the pass, now had a different mission. They did not try to stop the Ottoman retreat. They channeled it. They pushed and harried and drove from the south, funneling the fleeing Ottoman soldiers into the narrowest sections of the valley, where the geography did the killing. Men who tried to go north hit the steep ridgeline. Men who tried to ford the Drin hit the soft banks or the current itself. The white Drin in September is not a drowning river, but it is cold, and it is fast, and armored men who enter it in panic do not always come out. The Albanian infantry, moving faster on foot through their own terrain than armored Ottoman soldiers running in fear, ran them down. The Stradioti cavalry swept around the flanks of the fleeing mass and hit the edges. The pursuit lasted hours. It extended miles beyond the initial ambush site, through the afternoon and into the early evening, until the light began to fail and even Skanderbeg's exhausted soldiers could run no further. The Ottoman army did not simply lose this battle, it ceased to exist as a functional military force. Isolated groups would filter back east over the following days, stumbling through mountains they did not know, harried by Albanian villagers and ambushed at water sources and passes by local fighters who had not even been part of the main battle. Of the 40,000 men who marched into the Albulena Pass on the morning of September 2nd, the casualty figures from contemporary sources range widely, as they always do in medieval battles. But the consistent picture is of an army that lost somewhere between a quarter and a third of its total strength killed, with a comparable number wounded, captured, or simply lost in the mountains. Some sources suggest even higher losses. The survivors who reached Ottoman territory carried with them not just their wounds, but something harder to treat: the knowledge that it could happen. That an Albanian mountain warlord with a fraction of the manpower could take the empire's army apart piece by piece on terrain of his own choosing. That knowledge would shape Ottoman calculations about Albania for the remainder of Skanderbeg's life. The silence that fell over the Albulena Valley in the late afternoon of September 2nd was the kind of silence that only comes after overwhelming violence. Not peaceful silence, but empty silence. A silence made of absence. The valley floor was covered in the dead. Ottoman dead and Albanian dead both, though the ratio was brutal. Historians working from the available sources estimate Albanian casualties at somewhere between 500 and 2,000, a significant toll, but proportional to what they had accomplished. Ottoman dead were counted, as best they could be counted, in the thousands. Contemporary Albanian chronicles claim figures as high as 15,000 killed outright. Ottoman sources do not preserve detailed casualty accounts from this engagement, which is itself a kind of evidence. Armies that win document their victories. Armies that suffer humiliating defeats do not rush to publish the exact dimensions of the humiliation. Isa Beg Ishakovic survived the battle, which is more than many of his senior officers managed. He was identified by Albanian witnesses near the eastern end of the pass as the rout began, and accounts suggest he escaped with a personal escort of Sipahi cavalry who had managed to maintain some cohesion during the collapse. His escape was not glorious. He rode hard and did not stop until he was well outside Albanian territory. His military career did not immediately collapse. He continued to serve the Ottoman state in subsequent years, but he was never again given command of a major campaign against Skanderbeg. That distinction was earned in the hardest possible way. Among the senior Ottoman officers who did not escape, several Bey-level commanders were killed in the initial ambush phase, their heavier armor making them identifiable targets for Albanian crossbowmen who had been told to prioritize the men giving orders. The loss of multiple senior officers in the first hour was part of what made the Ottoman command response so sluggish during the critical middle phase. The column was attempting to reorganize while simultaneously processing a command vacuum at the level just below Isa Beg. The battlefield itself, in the hours after the fighting ended, was a landscape of extraordinary desolation. The valley road was no longer a road. It was a corridor of the fallen, of abandoned equipment and broken weapons, and the flags and banners that armies carry into battle and leave behind when they run. The Ottoman supply train, unable to move forward or back during the fighting, was captured almost entirely intact, which mattered enormously to the Albanians, not just for the material value of weapons and food and coin, but for the intelligence value of the documents and communications that traveled with a major Ottoman field army. In the following days, Skanderbeg moved quickly to exploit the victory before the Ottomans could process what had happened and mount a response. He ordered the fortification of several additional passes in the Drin Valley, put his remaining cavalry to work clearing the mountains of isolated Ottoman survivors, and sent messengers, urgent, specific messengers, to the Christian courts of Europe with accounts of the victory. These messages were not mere boasts. They were a carefully calculated diplomatic instrument designed to remind the Pope, the Italian city-states, Venice, and the Kingdom of Naples that Albania was not merely surviving, but fighting and winning, and that a small investment of European support could keep the Ottoman advance stalled in these mountains for years longer. Venice had been watching the Albanian situation with the calculated attention of a city-state whose Adriatic trade routes depended on stability in the eastern coast ports. The Battle of Albulena prompted a renewed round of Venetian-Albanian negotiations. Venice's relationship with Skanderbeg had always been complicated. The Serenissima could recognize his value as a buffer against Ottoman expansion, while simultaneously resenting his independence and occasionally negotiating with Constantinople behind his back. But Albulena simplified the calculation. A commander who could destroy 40,000 Ottoman soldiers in a morning was worth backing, regardless of the inconveniences of his personality. Naples had been a previous backer of Skanderbeg, and the news of Albulena reinvigorated that relationship. Alfonso V's son, Ferrante, now king, would continue to provide episodic financial and material support to the Albanian cause. The papal curia, always scanning the eastern horizon for news that might justify renewed crusading enthusiasm in a Western Christendom that was increasingly exhausted by the idea, circulated accounts of the victory with transparent pleasure. Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, who had become Pope Pius II the following year, and would spend much of his pontificate trying and largely failing to organize a new crusade, cited Skanderbeg's campaigns as proof that Muslim expansion was not inevitable, that geography and will could hold what politics could not. The physical ground of Albulena, the pass, the valley, the ridge lines, had been transformed in a single morning from contested terrain into something approaching a sacred space in Albanian national consciousness. The story began to be told, immediately, and with the intensity that oral cultures bring to their most important events. Not as a military history lesson, as a foundation story, as evidence that the mountains themselves had chosen sides. The strategic consequences of Albulena were not immediately visible in the way that some battles announced their significance. There was no treaty signed in its aftermath, no map redrawn, no throne that changed hands. But in the longer logic of history, the battle's weight was enormous. Consider what the map of Europe looked like in September 1457. Constantinople had been Ottoman for 4 years. The Serbian despotate was crumbling. It would fall entirely within the decade. Athens was already under Ottoman administration. The Peloponnese was being contested. The Aegean Islands were going one by one. The Ottoman advance into the Balkans was not gradual seepage. It was a flood. And against that flood, the geography of Albania represented something that strategic planners in Venice and Rome and Naples understood viscerally: the last mountain wall before the Adriatic coast. If the Albanian coast fell, Ottoman naval and ground forces would be within striking distance of the heel of Italy. The Adriatic, the inland sea that Venice's entire commercial and political empire depended on, would become an Ottoman lake. The mathematics of that geography were why so many distant powers had been sending money and occasional troops to Albania since the resistance began. Not out of affection for Albanians, out of naked self-interest, dressed in the available language of Christian solidarity. Albulena bought time. This is not a small thing. In 1457, Mehmed II, the conqueror, the man who had taken Constantinople, was planning his next Grat campaign. The Western Balkans were on his agenda. Albania sat astride the route to Italy, to the Adriatic, to the rest of the Christian West. If Skanderbeg had been broken at Albulena, if Isa Beg's 40,000 had swept the country, taken Kruja, ended the resistance. The Ottoman advance into the Western Balkans would have accelerated by decades. The buffer that a free Albania provided for Venice's Adriatic position, for the Kingdom of Naples, for the still fragile Italian states, was not abstract. It was geographical. It was real. Skanderbeg would fight for another decade after Albulena. He died in January 1468 of malaria in the city of Lezhë after 25 years of continuous warfare. He never lost a major engagement in the field. The Ottomans took Albania within 10 years of his death, which tells you something about how much of the defense had resided in one mind. But those additional years mattered. They mattered because they preserved the idea that the Ottomans could be stopped, at a moment in European history when that idea needed proof. Every year that the Albanian mountains held was a year that the Italian states could organize, that the papacy could raise crusading funds, that the Latin West could at least imagine a viable defense. Whether that defense ever materialized in adequate form is a different and sadder story. What mattered in the immediate decades was that the possibility remained open. The Battle of Albulena. Albulena also contributed something to the developing art of warfare that went largely unrecognized in formal military treatises, because those treatises were being written far from Albanian mountain passes. The use of terrain as a force multiplier, not just as cover or obstacle, but as an active tactical element, a weapon in itself, was not invented at Albulena, but the precision and sophistication with which Skanderbeg employed it there represented a level of operational planning that would not become standard military doctrine for centuries. The coordinated three-element ambush, the deliberate use of the reserve at the psychological turning point, the channeling of the pursuit. These were not instinctive warrior virtues. They were the product of a military education acquired inside the empire that Skanderbeg was fighting, turned against the teacher. In Albania, Skanderbeg never stopped being a figure of the living present tense. He became Skanderbeg, the national hero, the one who held the mountains, whose double-headed eagle became the national symbol, whose name is on the central square in Tirana today. His image adorns currency and stamps and public buildings. The story is told with the kind of reverential intensity that a people reserves for the moments that define what they believe themselves to be capable of. The valley of Albulena is quiet now. The white Drin still runs between its soft banks, still cold, still fast, still carrying the meltwater of mountains that have been watching human affairs for a very long time. The chestnuts still turn gold in September. The fog still comes in the early morning. If you walked the valley floor today, you would find no monument to what happened there. The fighting was to diffuse, spread over to many miles of ridgeline, for a single marker to mean much. But the ground knows. Centuries later, the pass is simply a road through the mountains. Cars move through it now, moving fast, indifferent to the ridgelines above. And somewhere up on those slopes, in the places where the trees are oldest, and the rock faces still show the marks of old pathways, there is a silence that was earned on the morning of September 2nd, 1457, by 10,000 men who chose to stand in the fog and wait for a serpent of 40,000 to put its head into the mountains. They waited, they struck, and the serpent broke. Some battles decide who wins the war. This one decided something older and harder. Who would be allowed to keep fighting at all?